Welcome to this talk, which is called Human Factors in Security, and we're going to be talking about how to get towards something that looks like security-conscious development. My name is Molly Crowther. I forgot to put my name on this slide, but hopefully you know where you are. I am known mostly for Cloud Foundry vulnerability management, is where many of you may have heard of me. I also have done a stint in R&D at Pivotal with customer security assessments. So when Pivotal's customers come at us with, we just did an assessment of your product and these are all the things wrong with it, I help them figure out which things are important. I have also been on the security leadership team at Pivotal and participated in a couple rounds of security education for our different development teams for Cloud Foundry, and that's a little bit about what I'm going to be talking about. This is a really nice picture of the Grand Tetons. What I'm going to be actually talking about today is not like a fun story about how we got to the mountains, because we're not there yet. So I'm going to be talking more about how can we get closer to this thing that is in the distance that everybody wants to get to, but it's not going to be like a feel-good story of, we went on a long hike and finally we got there, and this is how you get there too. It's definitely not going to be about that. So the first thing I want to talk about is, why does security training actually matter? Like, why did we decide this was a thing that we actually wanted to focus on at Pivotal? I think we usually talk a lot about the feedback loop between developers and their users. At Pivotal, we're doing a lot of platform development. We're not doing, like in R&D, we're not doing as much like pure application development that most of the people at this conference are doing. But it's sort of the same thing. We've got users, we've got developers, they need to talk to each other. The developers need to really understand their users and what their users want. And they do this by creating code that goes to production that their users can use and the users give feedback on. I think traditionally, security groups within companies, and within kind of traditional IT organizations think of themselves as the superheroes that are protecting the users from the developers. They often get in the way and they prevent developer code from getting to production because it's unsafe for whatever reason. This is how people traditionally think of it. The way that we like to think of it is more that developers are going to interact with their users no matter what. Their code's eventually going to get to production. And there's these malicious actors out in the world, which usually show up as advanced persistent threats, that they're the ones going after the users. They're the ones kind of getting feedback about kind of what they can get out of the system, what they can get from users. And they're kind of directly going after the people we consider our customers. So in a perfect world, what this looks more like is the developer team has the access that they need to feedback from their customers. The security team are acting more like teachers or coaches to those developers, and hopefully the malicious actors are kind of in the picture less overall. One of the things that we've learned over time, and that hopefully other people can recognize as well, is that your security team absolutely cannot scale one-to-one with your development team. Like, you can't have a security person, as they're traditionally known, sitting with every developer, making sure that they're creating something safe. You really can't, probably can't even have them with every pair, with every team, or even like embedded in every program. So you need to figure out a way to scale this coaching so that when a developer is, sitting at their computer at 4 p.m. on a Friday, the thing that they push to production isn't something that's going to be really unsafe to their users. So that's kind of in a nutshell why training matters to us, and not just, can we use the newest fancy AI tool to, create some sort of weird firewall that protects us against everything. Because developers are still going to write something that exposes a user's phone number to the internet or something by mistake. So that's why we need to help them figure out why they shouldn't be doing those things in the first place. Okay, so we all agree that training is important now, hopefully. So what do we actually do to start figuring out how to do this training? So one of the things that we consider really important at Pivotal is our values, which are do the right thing, do what works, and be kind. And as we tried to figure out how are we going to do this security education and how are we going to scale it across the organization, we needed to keep these values in mind, and they shaped the things that we eventually ended up experimenting with. Because all of what I'm going to talk about were experiments. We're not at the mountains yet. So the first thing we had to think about is, are we doing the right thing? And I would posit that most organizations, especially in the traditional IT space, are not getting security education right. They're sending out videos or PowerPoints that their employees have to look at, and it's going to teach them not to get phished, and they're going to get phished anyway. And it's not teaching them how to actually develop secure code. And even if it does, we still have a lot to think about how we do education correctly. Most people in the security space are not also in the education space, so there's a lot of kind of learning as you go about how do you actually teach people in a way that they're going to retain knowledge. At the end of the day, we figured for us the right thing and like the right way to teach people would be something that would actually be a value add to them and a culture add. So we wanted to help increase security knowledge, but increase security kind of consciousness within the entire culture at Pivotal. So there are a bunch of ways that we attempted to do that, but this is just covering kind of the education piece. The other thing we had to think about is, are we doing what's actually going to work? The GIF here is a dog being scared by someone trying to put homework in his face. So yeah, like we can't do something like that because that's not actually going to work. We can't give people, all this stuff that they have to do on their own time. And at the end of the day, we wanted to actually make sure that we were improving the security of our products and not just kind of checking a box or doing lip service to the notion of security. And part of that is helping developers have the ability to deliver secure outcomes. Like we can't take away the actual delivery of outcomes in order to get security. Obviously, the most secure thing would just to be not to let anyone push anything to production ever, but that's not going to fulfill our mission. And we also thought a lot about how can we actually measure this effectiveness. I don't think we got 100% of the way there on the actual measurements, but it was something that we were thinking about kind of over time. And the last thing is just, is it kind? Like, are we doing something that's either going to be a lot of work for our future selves or the future selves of the teams that we're working with? And I'll talk about this a little bit later. And we want to make sure we're also being kind to their users. So if we teach our developers that users shouldn't be able to copy paste into a password field, like that's one of a lot of our pet peeves. Like you need to be able to copy paste into a password field so you can have a secure password. But if we're teaching them to do things that are unkind to their users, that's not a positive outcome either. Okay, so I'm gonna talk a little bit about the 3 experiments that we did. And this is just kind of an overview of the things that we were thinking about. There were a lot of people involved in doing these experiments, including Alex Jackson, who's in the room, as well as a few other engineering folks at Pivotal and a few people who aren't at Pivotal anymore. The things we actually kept in mind, like as we were doing these experiments, were who are we actually including in the experiments? How much time is it actually taking from a team? What are the kind of topics we're going to cover? And are these teams going to have stories, like user stories at the end coming out of this exercise? So those were a couple of things that we changed over the course of the kind of year and a half that we were working on this. So we had some hypotheses that we were attempting to test. I don't know if we actually thought about it that way when we started out, but the first exercise that we did was we had the hypothesis that we could improve security for the teams by kind of teaching them about some traditional security concepts that we figured they probably didn't know about already, and then doing a very full-scale audit of their product, mostly from the fear that if we missed anything, that it could be bad for the team and bad for the company. So we did this with about 15 component teams over the course of about 6 to 9 months. There were some pros to this approach, which were that it was easy to scale. We basically had a PowerPoint that just about anybody could give as long as they read it over a little bit ahead of time. It covered kind of what are the different threats you're worried about? What are these advanced persistent threats like state actors and things like that that might try to attack our products? It covered the Microsoft Stride like threat modeling framework. So it was very sort of basic stuff, but also not hugely interesting by itself. Teams felt that it was relevant to their daily work kind of at the end when we took like informal polls of what did you like about this exercise, what didn't you like. Teams thought that the audit felt like it directly impacted work that they were doing every day because they were talking about their product and they were talking about the thing that they were working on right now. Some of the cons were that a huge number of stories for the team would end up being generated by the exercise. So it actually meant that our team had to follow up very diligently because the teams weren't actually prioritizing these stories or getting them done. So we realized that like the outcome of a huge number of stories from the exercise wasn't actually a positive outcome because nothing was actually getting done afterwards. The question was, what was the actual mechanism of the audit, which is a great question. We basically had them draw like a full architecture diagram of their component of the platform on the whiteboard. And then as a full team, which could be up to like a dozen people, we would kind of poke holes in all of the different parts using Stride. So it ended up being very comprehensive, but maybe a little bit too comprehensive because there wasn't enough focus. We also saw that a number of teams would have 1 or 2 people dominating the conversation for basically the whole afternoon. Like you could tell that not everybody on the team was engaged, and that was kind of an anti-goal for us. It was also not good for people who had just joined the team. Because we do so much rotation at Pivotal, there would always be at least like 1 new person on the team. Sorry, somebody's phone is making noise. Or it's out there, okay. So it was not good for new people. There'd always be someone who had just joined the team like that Monday and had no idea what we were talking about, and they would just kind of have to absorb all day and they wouldn't be able to actually participate. And there were also just kind of like unclear outcomes. Like, was the outcome to fix every security hole in the product? You know, that would be awesome, but probably not. A lot of these teams, if they were to stop working and just do the stories we had given them, would probably be working for at least like a quarter or 2, and they didn't really know how to prioritize the output. So this was our hypothesis. Oh, sorry, I thought I had another slide there. Oh, I went backwards. This was our hypothesis. Our results were that we kind of didn't feel like we were moving the needle enough. We had all these stories in the icebox that didn't get prioritized. And for a lot of us, this workshop like didn't feel pivotally enough. It was sitting an entire team down in a room, taking them away from their work for a day, lecturing at them for like several hours at a time, and then doing this giant exercise where not everybody felt included. And it just didn't, I don't know, it didn't sit well with some of us. So we did another round where we iterated a little bit on kind of the slide deck and the exercise. Our objectives in round 2 were for teams to understand a little bit more of the context about why we were actually talking to them, understanding the culture that we were trying to build. We also wanted to help them be more curious about the security of their product because when we left them with a huge icebox full of stories, if anybody asked about security in the future, it'd be like, well, we have these stories in the icebox, and like that's what security is to us. And that wasn't ideal. And then we also wanted them to know a little bit more about who they could actually talk to if they needed help, because we knew that we weren't going to be sitting with the developers all the time, and they needed to be able to know when to actually ask for help. So our second hypothesis was that we could improve the security of components by getting the team thinking about that healthy culture I was talking about, getting the team actually curious about security, and then doing some auditing of the product, but not making it kind of the huge full focus of the day. So this exercise was also the whole balance team. It also took up most of the day, but a lot of it was focused on culture. We actually found a couple of videos that were really interesting that were kind of different ways to think about security in the physical world, because it got people out of kind of thinking about code and how do I make my code secure. So there was one video by Deviant Ollam about how to break into doors without picking locks and without damaging the door. I actually used some of those techniques on a couple of Pivotal offices. It's pretty fun. But people like really engaged with those videos, and it made them more curious about like, how can I apply this knowledge to my actual product? And for the actual kind of auditing exercise, we didn't actually change that up too much. It was still kind of the same thing, but we didn't put quite as much focus on hitting every single part of the product. The pros to this one, it was also relatively easy to scale. It was a little bit harder because I think I had a lot of focus on the culture, and not everybody in the cohort of people running these put that much emphasis on it. So it wasn't quite as easy to scale as the one that was just like, read off these slides about what Stride is. People really engaged with the videos, and like the culture aspects of it were really, really good for new people who had just joined the team, because they could kind of understand that within a Pivotal context, and it wasn't all about just their products. The team still had too many stories. We still had people, like individual people dominating the conversation, and it still felt like people were getting kind of more engagement from the actual videos than from the exercise we were doing. Like we showed the videos over lunch, and you could look at people's faces, and there were like certain moments in the videos where like everyone would kind of go slack-jawed, like I didn't realize you could do that. And we didn't get as much of engagement with the actual exercise. So our results from round 2 were that it was a little bit better. We liked the kind of culture focus. There were still too many stories, and PMs were still pretty overwhelmed with how to actually prioritize them. Near the end of round 2, we actually had a pair of cognitive science people at Pivotal kind of start observing us and asking us some interesting questions about what we were doing. And they pushed us a little bit to improve the engagement of the whole team, because that was one of the things they noticed, that there were only kind of a couple people driving the conversation. They also tried to help us think about like, what's the worst that can happen when we're designing these exercises, because we want to try to prevent these things. We didn't really think about the fact that going in and talking to a team could actually cause overconfidence and actually make the product less safe. Because if teams think, oh, I got trained on security, I'm done, like I'm great at this now. We don't want to give them that overconfidence. And we also don't want to scare them so much that they're underconfident and kind of avoidant of anything related to security, because those are two kind of possible failure modes of getting this training. And they also encouraged us to think about something that I think is recognized at Pivotal, but maybe not in exactly these words, that like when you are interacting, even in a group, the interactions are always actually one-on-one. So right now, I'm talking to Sarah. There are people who are paying attention to me, but I can only really pay attention to one person at a time. So whenever you get these group dynamics doing these exercises, there's always going to be people who are kind of left out because they're not within that pair. So our third kind of round of experimentation was a vast departure from the original two. So we wanted to try to engage individual pairs within an engineering team for a short amount of time, rather than trying to take their whole day. We also wanted to make it fun so that they kind of had this experience of being a little bit uncomfortable because they're learning, but also making it a fun experience where they're generating ideas, they're having fun as a pair, so that they actually could leave the room like a little bit more interested in security than they were when they came in. And we wanted to see some of those kind of signals of curiosity, like we had seen when people were watching the video, like what does someone's face look like when they're engaged? And also we wanted to kind of see if we could measure an increase of thoughtfulness about security because of these exercises. So we did a bunch of pairing exercises. They took about 45 minutes per pair. They were split up into a warm-up and exercise and kind of a wrap-up. And I'm going to talk about what those look like in a second. And from here, it was mostly myself and Aaron Price kind of traveling around to different Pivotal offices, trying this with different teams. And we had some support from the CogSci pair as well. So really quickly, we wanted to basically take a pair, warm them up so kind of their brains were working, do an exercise, and then wrap up and leave them with some takeaways. So Aram and I first kind of had to describe who we were, what we were doing, and why. There were a couple offices where we visited, and nobody knew who we were, and it was just kind of like, we're the security pair, we're gonna talk about security. And they were like, how do we know you're really who you say you are? And we had to be like, you just have to trust us. Yeah, we broke in, and then we convinced them they had to tell us about how insecure their product was. Then we took a really quick video of each person in the pair. We asked them 0 to 5, rate how secure you think your product is and why. And I'll talk a little bit about why we did that in a minute. We gave them a quick definition of what we were calling usable or useful versus valuable information. Valuable information being stuff that people steal to sell, like credit card numbers or social security numbers, and useful information being things that people can use to jump around within a system, like IP addresses and admin, names of admins and things like that. The CogSci pair encouraged us to try to teach people as little as possible during this period, just to get them thinking. Because I think we recognized that teaching someone like hours and hours of information was not actually going to be retained. And then we did a quick brainstorming exercise of like, what do you think useful information is versus valuable information? Once we kind of got to a good place with the brainstorming exercise and they started to like peter out a little bit, we had them draw like a simple part of their system where they thought a lot of valuable information was being stored and kind of the data flow in and out of that part of the system. It was a lot simpler than drawing an architecture diagram of your entire component, and it also included new people on the team a little bit better because they could kind of reason about that one component. And then the exercise we did with them was basically like, we drew a dotted line around one part of the component and said, pretend you're inside the wall, everything outside of you has been taken over by a bad actor. What can they do with that information flowing in or out? And then the wrap up was we took a video asking the same question again, 0 to 5, how safe do you think your product is? And then we kind of debriefed a little bit with them, answered any questions they had about like, why did we do this exercise again? Like, who can I talk to if I have questions? So one thing that we learned, and this is like absolutely not conclusive data, but qualitatively, people did talk about their product a lot differently before and after the exercise. One of the things we did was actually ask them to rate 0 to 5 because we knew they were going to fixate on that number, and the number was what we didn't care about. So we were basically tricking them into thinking that we cared about the number so that they would feel comfortable kind of making that explanation without thinking that that was the thing that we were actually trying to grade. So the way that people talked about their product differently. Some people rated it less secure after they did the exercise. Some people rated about the same, but they were still able to like talk kind of more complexly about why they thought that. There weren't very many people who said after the exercise, oh, my product was more secure than I thought. There were probably a couple of those, but it wasn't common. But that was just kind of a qualitative thing that we noticed. The other thing that was great was we couldn't actually hit every single pair when we went to an office, and we found that people were actually like clamoring to be included. Like we went to somebody's team retro in Dublin, just like their Friday retro, and I think in the like sad column was like not everybody got to do the security workshop, and like in the column about questions, it was like, when can we do the security workshop? So that was really interesting to us because in the past, the workshops were a little bit like, I know this is something I have to do, but I don't actually really want to spend a whole day doing it. So we learned a lot of interesting things during these experiments. One of the things was just, it was really important to get the tasks that we were asking people to do very, very specific. Because if we weren't specific, people wanted to do what we were telling them to do, but if they didn't understand, they got kind of flustered. The room setup was really, really important. It was a pair of engineers and Aram and I as a pair, and like we wanted them to talk to each other and not talk to us. So if we had a room where we couldn't like back up away far enough from them, they would just continue talking to us, kind of like we were the teachers and they were trying to prove that they knew something rather than interacting with each other. There was a lot of learning about kind of pairing body language and trying to figure out when people were kind of engaged or shutting down. The second to last thing is what I mentioned about like, we were trying to get unbiased qualitative answers, so we tried to focus their attention on the quantitative thing, basically to trick them, but like in a good way. And we also noticed that like people were really, really interested in social engineering. During the generative exercise, the brainstorming, when we told them like, think about social engineering, think about what someone could do if they knew what gym you went to at what time, like what information could they get out of someone from that. And they just kind of, they really wanted to learn more about that. So what's the conclusion? Aram and I kind of went all around the world doing these experiments. We recorded a lot of video and photos about the experiments that maybe at some point we can analyze more of that data. We definitely had some interesting results, and I personally learned a lot about how to experiment on people and how to design these sorts of workshops. But it was also a lot more emotional labor than we expected. Aram and I did a trip that was 1 week in Dublin and then 1 week in Toronto. And by the time we got to Toronto, we were so exhausted that it was like, do we have to keep doing these workshops? Like, I think I might just want to sleep instead. We had a little bit of mismatch with what we wanted to get out of it versus what leadership wanted to get out of it. As things continued, I think we learned that at Pivotal, we have this notion that you do something small and you do it right, and then once you've done that, you can make it really big. And we weren't sure that that was actually the way we wanted to go with this particular exercise because we weren't positive that it was getting the results that we needed to get. And also, this wasn't Aram and I's like full-time job. We had to get back to our actual day jobs, which is why I mentioned that we're not at the mountains yet, but we did learn a lot of interesting things along the way. And if you want to learn a little bit more about the philosophy of security at Pivotal, I actually have a talk on Thursday at 12:30, talking more about how do we give people the ability to kind of halt the production line when there are security problems. And that's it. Yes.
On your third one, have you gone back to see if there have been changes? Because at the first you had stories and you actually had backlogs of things to work on. The third, there really was no way of seeing changes. Have you gone back to see if it actually has caused a change in the way they develop code or approach it?
That is a good question. So the question is, have we gone back and seen how teams have changed how they approach security? No, but also like, I think it was also kind of complicated just because of how quickly teams and products change at Pivotal. So if we went back to those teams, those people probably wouldn't be there anymore. They would have like moved on to other teams or other products. But it might be interesting to see kind of like the scaling effects of that redistribution of people, yeah, over time.
Outside of the process stuff, is there anything specific you can share about insights you got about what a lot of developers are doing wrong with their security?
So the question was whether we got any insights in what people were doing wrong. That's an interesting question. I think there were things that we definitely recognized that people weren't thinking about. Like I think teams were generally thinking about like, how do we protect data in transit? Because people have been asking that about Cloud Foundry for a long time. Like, is this connection TLS? Is that connection TLS? So those things they would like unprompted be like, well, this connection's TLS, so it's okay. But there were other things probably, like this was a long time ago, but I'm sure there were other things that the teams were doing wrong in similar ways, but it was also just that they're thinking, like they were just missing kind of the threat models of like, what would people want to do with this information? So like they weren't always protecting information that would help an actor like jump around the system. Like they would do a really good job protecting like PII or kind of important system data, but they weren't caring quite as much about like what if someone convinces you to send your logs somewhere that's not where they're supposed to go, things like that. Any other questions? I think we're out of time anyway, but was there one?
Are we out of time?
You can come ask after.
Okay.
Cool, thanks.